Hello and welcome to our third episode of Agile TD Mondays. Today I'm in Spain, as you can see, in a hotel room, and with me is Roman Pichler, and he is going to talk about his proven tips for writing great user stories. So to you, Roman.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Sabine, and thanks for having me. User stories, they're an interesting tool for me. They're so simple that it seems to be little, to in a way suggest and discuss about them. I mean, there's so little to them, really. It's literally about telling a story and capturing it. At the same time, I've seen many teams struggle to effectively apply user stories. And so what I'd like to do in the next 18 minutes or so is to touch on those factors that are key to work with user stories successfully in my experience. And it's hopefully an opportunity for the seasoned user story practitioner amongst you to reflect on your practice. And for those of you who are not quite so experienced, to maybe pick up a few new ideas or tips. And I'm aware that the announcement said I was going to talk about 10 tips on user stories. But when I prepared the talk and I considered the time more closely, I figured that 10 tips would be a little bit too ambitious and pushing it too much. So I decided to select the 4 most important ones, and I hope that's okay. So my first tip is to know your users. And I do have a picture of a user here. Somebody looking slightly startled at his screen. Now, as its name suggests, a user story describes how a user or customer uses the product and captures a feature or some product functionality. For instance, when we do some online shopping on a website like Amazon, for instance, searching an item or purchasing it. And one of the central ideas of user stories, as you probably know, is to describe a digital product from the perspective of the user. And the reason for this is to avoid what's referred to as a solution-centric approach, where we worry more about how to provide and implement the product features than why and how people will use them in the first place. So understanding who the users are and why they would want to use the product is essential for discovering and creating the right stories. Let me put this differently. If you do not know who your users are and what problem they want to see addressed, or which benefit they would like to experience, then you are not in a position to create any user stories. So don't do it. Because otherwise, you're in danger of speculating about the product functionality rather than systematically deriving features from the user needs. Now, I'd like to take this a step further and suggest that in order to create great stories, you should meet the actual users. This is not to say that you should expect that the users will tell you correctly what the product should do for them and tell you essentially the stories. I think it's our job as members of an agile team to figure this out. But I find it difficult to truly understand what users want and what they need, and to be able to walk in their shoes, put myself in their position if I haven't talked to them, or if I haven't observed them, if I haven't seen them using the product or a similar product. Now, I know that some product managers and product owners don't have access to the users and are well shielded by the sales team or management. And I also understand that development team members, including testers, tend to see the users even less frequently. But again, if we want to develop a product that does a great job for the users, and if we want to create the right stories, then we should really try to get to know those people, the people who will use our product. So that was the first tip. Try and get to know your users, try and get close to your users before you write any stories. Now, my next tip is about creating stories together. And here's another little picture for you. So when I first came across user stories, that was about 15 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. I think it was in 2000. I was really surprised by their lack of detail. So So I was used to working with use cases, and initially I had a hard time getting my head around the sketchiness of stories. It's like, where are all those details? Like, where's that stuff? And user stories seem to me less like requirements and more like notes. And of course, that's exactly what they're meant to be. Notes that capture the essence of a conversation. And so on its own, a user story is pretty useless. It needs to be, it must be complemented with a conversation between the person in charge of the product manager or product owner, and the cross-functional development team. And maybe it's helpful to take a quick look at the context in which user stories emerged, do a little bit of agile history. Stories were first used in extreme programming in combination with the role of an on-site customer. And the on-site customer is a member of the user community, is meant to know what the product should do, is co-located with the team and works on the team. So, acts as an acceptance tester on the team, acceptance tests the functionality. And the on-site customer is expected to tell the team what should be built in the next iteration in form of a story. And that conversation is then captured on a paper card as a reminder of what was discussed. And so what agile approaches happily accept is to work with tacit knowledge. So knowledge that is not explicitly expressed and written down, but is contained in our heads. And they prefer face-to-face conversation over requirements documents. Why is that? I mean, if you've undergone some traditional requirements training like I have, it seems to be counterintuitive, because traditionally people say, like, well, we need to truly understand all the requirements up front and try and get them down, and in as much detail as we possibly can. Then we look at them and we can identify anything that's unclear and inconsistencies, and we can use all those clear requirements for planning. So why would we want to be sketchy? Well, the reason is to speed up the development process, to very, very quickly implement functionality and very quickly release it to at least selected users and customers, and see if the functionality works for them. So we can then make changes, improvements, amendments. So that's the purpose. We want to go fast and be light. And you can take this even further and co-create the user stories. So a product owner, product manager, and the development team members, including testers, discover new stories together and amend existing ones based on the feedback and data collected from the users. And this leverages the team's collective creativity and knowledge, and tends to result in better, clearer stories, in my experience. To leverage this approach, I would suggest that you make collaborative story creation part of your product backlog grooming, or if you prefer, product backlog refinement process. So whenever you get together to work on the product backlog, do it as a team and see it as an opportunity to amend existing stories, delete existing stories, and refine some of the stories. Now, if you cannot have at least a meaningful, helpful conversation, so if product owner and team cannot discuss new stories together, so that the team understands those stories and can make suggestions for improving them or splitting them, then you're not in a position for telling and capturing stories, and you should not use them as a tool, as a technique. And never ever hand off stories. Don't do it. As I said earlier, the conversation really is an essential, mandatory part of the user story. And without it, the user story is either not usable, it's too vague and open for interpretation, or it becomes bloated and loaded with details. Now, if you are in a position where you work, for instance, with a remote team, and it's difficult to effectively work with that team and write the stories together and discuss them in detail, maybe because there's a language barrier, maybe because you've never had the opportunity to meet those guys face to face, then I would suggest you're better off using a different technique, such as use cases. They provide more structure and allow you to capture more details, but they're also more effort to create and update. But they do come with things like pre and post conditions and triggers and a main success scenario and alternative success scenarios, exception scenarios. So, lots of details, lots of detail that you can capture if you wish. And this allows you to describe the product functionality in a more systematic, detailed manner. And as I said, that may be beneficial when you wide teams. So don't forget, whenever you work with stories, that the conversation between the product owner, product manager, and the development team is not optional. It's truly mandatory. And whenever you can, I would recommend that you create the stories together. So that was my second suggestion. And the third one is to keep things simple. Keep things simple. Now, user stories themselves are a very simple tool. We simply tell stories about how users are likely to interact with the product, and then capture the essence of those stories, and that's it. And some of you may know that in the early days of the agile movement, people didn't talk so much about user stories. Instead, they used a different term. They talked about story cards. And the reason for this is that stories were captured primarily on paper cards, on index cards. And paper cards have two advantages. They facilitate collaboration and they facilitate visualization. So they make it easy for people to work together and to visualize the stories. Everybody can write on a paper card. You just need the paper cards and a pen. and the cards can be easily arranged on a table or on the office wall. And I find electronic tools are less conducive to collaboration. One person is usually in charge of the keyboard and the tool. And additionally, the information is often hidden in the tool. It's not as easy to display the stories, visualize them in the team room on the office wall. So I would encourage you to experiment with paper cards to capture your stories. At least when you create new stories, just give it a go, try it out. Bring some paper cards, a pile of index cards to your next product backlog or product backlog grooming, refinement, or story writing session. You can always key them into your favorite electronic tools afterwards, of course, if you wish. But let me warn you, I've seen more than one team who decided after some experimentation to switch from electronic to paper-based stories. So that can happen. And in another area where I find story writing benefits from some simplification are the acceptance criteria. They sometimes attract quite a bit of concern and also complexity, I find. Now, acceptance criteria, traditionally written at the back of a paper card, simply want to communicate what needs to be in place so that the story can be considered done. And the corresponding functionality can be demoed or released to a user or customer. And so the acceptance criteria really shouldn't be a big deal. They should follow fairly naturally from the narrative by asking, how can we tell that the story is done? How can we tell? And I therefore have a preference to simply listing the acceptance criteria rather than using some elaborate way to express them. Again, I think it's useful to remember stories want to facilitate rapid development. It's really about implementing and testing out an idea very quickly and providing new functionality, enhanced functionality swiftly to the users. So if we make things complicated, then the stories become harder to understand, and this starts to slow us down. So keep your story writing practice simple. Try maybe to experiment with paper cards if you haven't done so, and look for opportunities to simplify your stories, particularly in the area of acceptance criteria. So, and this brings me to my fourth and final suggestion, and that is about recognizing when user stories are not the best possible choice. So there's a photograph here, which you're looking at, and it has several tools in it. The most important one, certainly for me, is the coffee cup. Now, slightly more seriously, there's some proper tools, I guess, a laptop, a phone, and a notepad. And all these tools have their strengths and weaknesses, and we use them for different purposes. Now, the same is true for user stories. They again have their strengths and limitations, and there are certain things that they're really good for, and other things, well, I don't think they're that great at. So what are they good for? In my mind, particularly capturing product functionality, things people can do with a digital product. Again, if you take an online shopping experience, the ability to search for items, the ability to look at those items, see if they're suitable for you, and then go through a checkout process and pay them, and choose some delivery options. Those would all be examples of what is traditionally referred to as functional requirements. And so in addition to those functional requirements, digital products typically have non-functional qualities. So things around robustness and performance, scalability, usability. In these non-functional aspects, they can also be described with user stories. We may have to adjust them a little bit and tweak them, but generally we can tell stories about those qualities, and that's great. But there are other areas where user stories aren't quite so strong, and these are really the user interface and the user interaction. So I would prefer to capture user interface ideas with the help of sketches and mock-ups, rather than trying to describe them as part of a story. And for the user interaction, I like to work with things like scenarios or workflow diagrams, storyboards, and story maps. So use stories when they're really helpful for you, and recognize that particularly the user interface design and the user interaction are probably better captured using different techniques. But in a way, that's not all. User stories really, as I've said before, they want to allow us to move quickly. So sometimes it's simply not necessary to write any stories at all. So if you want to quickly create a throwaway prototype or a mock-up to test out, validate an idea and see if that would make sense for a user, then writing stories may not be necessary. So I have a preference to work with stories when some actual code is written and it's likely that the software will be reused. So then I find stories quite helpful. Otherwise, as I've said before, you may be able just to skip that step and just purely work with the mock-up. Again, user stories are not about documenting requirements. In a way, they're not really agile requirements. They want to enable you to move fast and develop software as quickly as possible, not to impose any overhead. So they should be one of the tools that you use. They should be in your toolbox, in your product toolbox, but they shouldn't be the only tool. So do complement them with other tools. And that's it, really. That was all I have prepared. And I think I've consumed the 18 minutes. So I hope that this brief talk was helpful for you and has helped you reflect on how you work with user stories, and maybe has allowed you to discover some new ideas, how to improve your practice. Thank you for watching and listening. You can find out more about user stories and some other product management tools and techniques on my website. And if there's time, and if there are any questions, then I'd be delighted to try and answer some of them.
Because you were talking about mock-ups, and I'm a non-tester, so I'm curious to know what mock-ups are.
Oh yes, yeah, good question. So what's a mock-up? Mock-up really is just a lightweight, typically throwaway prototype. So if you wanted to, for instance, test out if requiring users to register with an online shopping product would create a barrier for them, that they click away because for them the registration process may be too cumbersome, then you could just put together a very quick prototype. It could be a paper prototype, or it could be a clickable prototype, like a clickable wireframe using a software tool. and do a quick usability test, or maybe a few usability tests. So a mock-up is just really something that mimics the final product, but is typically very easy, very quick to create, and is typically a throwaway artifact, a throwaway product. A mock-up, a throwaway prototype can very quickly help you understand if your design and if your assumptions are correct or not.
Okay, thank you for your explanation. And I want to encourage you to check out the program of the Agile Testing Days US homepage, because we have extended the super early bird discount pricing. And please register if you haven't done yet. And please join me next week when Jill Silberfeld is talking about a unit testing strategy. So thank you, Roman, for joining me. And I see you next week. Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.